Well, hi everybody, Grandpa Tim here again, and we are continuing with the story of The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Today we'll have the third installment. Now, you can see I've changed locations. I've moved from my den up to my home office. The lighting's quite a bit better, which makes it easier for me to read. We'll see how this one goes, and maybe we'll stay here, and maybe we'll move back down, or maybe when the weather gets nicer, we'll even read outside one of these days. So here we go. With this installment of The Hobbit, we are still at Bilbo's house. They haven't left on their adventure yet. Thorin Oakenshield has been explaining the whole process, and Bilbo has just asked why they're even doing this. And so Thorin Oakenshield, who is the king of the dwarves, is explaining why they're going to go back and try to take the mountain of Erebor away from Smaug, the evil dragon. So here we go. Thorin Oakenshield talking. The few of us that were well outside sat and wept in hiding, and we cursed Smaug. And there we were unexpectedly joined by my father and my grandfather with singed beards. They looked very grim, but they said very little. When I asked how they got away, they told me to hold my tongue, and said that one day in the proper time I would know. After that we went away, and we have had to earn our living as best we could up and down the lands, often sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we have never forgotten our stolen treasure, and even now, when I will allow we have a good bit laid by and we are not so badly off, we still mean to get it back, and to bring our curses home to Smaug, if we can. I have often wondered about my father's and my grandfather's escape. I see now they must have had a private side door which only they knew about. But apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got hold of it and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir. Remember, Gandalf had a map and a key. I did not get hold of it. I was given it, said Gandalf the wizard. Your grandfather Thror was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Azog the Goblin, and Thrain your father went away on the 21st of April, 100 years ago last Thursday, and has never been seen by you since. That's true, said Thorin. Gandalf continued, Well, your father gave me this to give to you, and if I have chosen my own time and my own way for handing it over, you can hardly blame me, considering the trouble I had to find you. Your father could not remember his own name when he gave me the paper, and he never told me yours. So on the whole, I think I ought to be praised and thanked. And here it is, he said, handing the map to Thorin. I don't understand, said Thorin. And Bilbo felt he would have liked to say the same. The explanation did not seem to really explain. The wizard said, slowly and grimly, Your grandfather gave the map to his son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventures of a most unpleasant sort he had. But he never got near the mountain. How he got there, I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the necromancer. That means like evil wizard. Whatever were you doing there? Asked Thorin with a shudder, and all the dwarves shivered. Never you mind, he said. I was finding things out, as usual, and a nasty, dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just barely escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless, that means he was crazy, and wandering, and he had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key. We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria, said Thorin. We must give a thought to this necromancer. Don't be absurd, said Gandalf. He is an enemy quite beyond the powers of all the dwarves put together, if they could be collected again from the four corners of the world. The one thing your father wished was for his son to read the map and use the key. The dragon and the mountain are more than big enough tasks for you." "Hear, hear," said Bilbo, and accidentally said it out loud. "Hear what?" they all said, turning suddenly toward him, and he was so flustered that he answered, "Hear what I've got to say." "Well, what is that?" they asked. "Well," said Bilbo, the Hobbit, "I should say that you ought to go east and have a look around. After all, there is the side door, and dragons must sleep sometimes, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you will think of something. And, well, don't you know, I think we have talked long enough for one night, if you see what I mean. What about bed and an early start and all that? I will give you a good breakfast before you go." "Before we go, I suppose you mean," said Thorin. "Aren't you the burglar? And isn't sitting on the doorstep your job? Not to speak of getting inside the door." "But I agree about bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with my ham when starting on a journey, fried, not poached, and mind you don't break 'em." After all the others had placed their breakfast orders without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much, they all got up. The Hobbit had to find room for them all, and filled his spare rooms and made beds on chairs and sofas before he got them all stowed away, and he went on his own very little bed, very tired and altogether not happy. One thing he did make up his mind about was not to bother to get up very early and cook everyone else's wretched breakfast. The tookishness was wearing off, and he was not now quite so sure that he was going on any journey in the morning. As he lay in bed, he could still hear Thorin humming to himself in the best bedroom right next to his. "Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to find our long-forgotten gold." Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he finally woke up. And that, if you can believe it, is the end of chapter 1 in the book. We're going to continue, which is page 40 in my book. Chapter 2, which is entitled Roast Mutton. Now, mutton is like sheep meat. It's like venison is deer meat, and beef is cow meat, and pork is pig meat. This is mutton, so sheep meat. Roast mutton is this chapter. Up jumped Bilbo, and putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room. There he saw nobody at all, but the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved, after all, to think that they had all gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up. But with never a thank you, he thought. And yet, in a way, he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. This feeling surprised him. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself, "thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age." So he put on an apron and lit some fires and boiled water and washed everything up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room. I like second breakfast. By the open window when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," he said, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you a message because they could not wait." "What message?" said Bilbo, all in a fluster. "Oh, great elephants," said Gandalf. "You are not at all yourself this morning. You have never even dusted the mantelpiece." "Well, what has that got to do with it?" said Bilbo. "I've had enough to do with just washing up for 14. If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this just under the clock, said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own notepaper. This is what he read. Thorne and Company, to Bilbo Baggins, our burglar. Greetings. For your hospitality, our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of professional assistance, our grateful acceptance. These are the terms: cash on delivery, up to and not exceeding 1/14 of the total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn in the city of Bywater at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual, that means on time. We have the honor to remain yours deeply, Thorne and Company. Gandalf said, that leaves you just 10 minutes. You'll have to run. But, said Bilbo. No time for it, said the wizard. But, said Bilbo again. No time for that either. Off you go. To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, without a walking stick or any money or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, putting his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the mill, across the water, and then on for a whole mile or more to Bywater. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11, and found he had come without a pocket handkerchief. Bravo, said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were all on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggage, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. That means all kinds of stuff. There was a very small pony, too, apparently for Bilbo. Up you two get, and off we go, said Thorin. I am awfully sorry, said Bilbo. But I have come without my hat, and I have left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note until 10:45, to be precise. Well, don't be precise, said Dwalin, and don't worry. You will have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many other things before you get to the journey's end. And as for a hat, I have a spare hood and cloak in my luggage. And that's how they all came to start. Jogging off from the inn one fine morning, just before May, on well-laden ponies, that means really packed full of stuff, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood and a dark green cloak that he borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, of course, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I don't dare think. His only comfort was that he couldn't be mistaken for his dwarf, since he had no beard. They had not been riding very long, when up came Gandalf, very splendid on a big white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs, and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that the party went along merrily, and they told stories and sang songs as they rode forward all day, except, of course, when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through the Hobbit lands, a wild, respectable country inhabited by decent folk, with good roads, a couple of nice inns, that means like hotels, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely, and they sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, and no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills rising higher and higher, dark with an evil look to them, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. "To think it will be June soon," grumbled Bilbo, as he splashed along behind the others in a muddy track. It was after tea time, it was pouring with rain, and it had been raining all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes, his cloak was full of water, the pony was tired and stumbled on stones. The others were too grumpy to talk. "And I'm sure the rain has gotten into the dry clothes and into the food bags," thought Bilbo. "Oh, bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hobbit hole by the fire, with the kettle just beginning to sing." It was not the last time he wished that. Still, the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the gray clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark. The wind got up and the willows along the river bank bent and sighed. I don't know what river it was, a rushing red one, swollen with the rains of the last few days, that came down from the hills and mountains in front of them. Soon it was nearly dark. The winds broke up the gray clouds, and a waning moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper and, where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on? Not until then did they finally notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten the most and talked the most and laughed the most. But now he simply was not there at all. He was the most gone. "Just when a wizard would have been most useful too," groaned Dori and Nori, who shared the hobbits' view about regular meals, that they should be plenty and often. They decided in the end that they would have to camp where they were. So far they had not camped before on this journey. And though they knew that they would soon have to camp regularly, when they were among the misty mountains and far from the lands of respectable people, it seemed like a bad wet evening to begin on. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves and the drip, drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gotten into the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night. Not even Owen and Glowin, who were especially good at starting fires. Helpful fires, campfires. Then one of the ponies took a fright at nothing and bolted. That means he ran off. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, Keely and Feely were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away off him. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper, and even less for breakfast. Camera seemed to pause there for a second. Let's hit that again. They all sat there glum and wet and muttering, while Owen and Glowin went on trying to light the fire and quarreling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures are not all pony riders in May sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "Hey, there's a light over there." There was a hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or maybe torches. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they could but go and see, and anything was better than very little supper and less breakfast and wet clothes all night. Others said, "These parts are none too well known and are too near the mountains. Travelers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use. Things have changed for the worse, and the road is not guarded. They have seldom even heard of the king," that means Thorin, "the king around here. And the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you're likely to find." And some of them said, "Well, after all, there are 14 of us." And others said, "Well, where has Gandalf got to?" This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Owen and Glóin really began to fight. Well, that settled it. After all, they said, "Well, we have got a burglar with us." And so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the woods. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or to a farm. And do what they could, they made a great deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and moaning as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly, the red light shone out very brightly through the tree trunks, not far ahead. "Now it is the burglar's time," they said, meaning Bilbo. "You must go on and find out all about that light, and what it is for, and if it is all perfectly safe and canny," said Thorin to the hobbit. "Now scuttle off, and come back quickly, if all is well. If not, come back if you can. Now if you can't come back, hoot twice like a barn owl, and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can." So off Bilbo had to go, before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of an owl any more than he could fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in the woods, absolutely quietly. They take a pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all this dwarfish racket as they went along, though I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night. Not if the whole cavalcade passed 2 feet away. As for Bilbo walking primly toward the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally he got right up to the fire, for a fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting around a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton, remember that's sheep meat, toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell, and there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking right out of the jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously, they were trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that. From their great, heavy faces on them, and of their size, and from the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing room proper at all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow," said one of the trolls. "Never a blinking bit of man-flesh have we had for long enough," said the second one. "What William was a-thinking of to bring us into these parts at all beats me, and the drink running short, and what's more," he said, jogging his elbow at William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said as soon as he could. "You can't expect folks to stop by here forever just to be et by you and Bert. You've had a village and a half between you since we come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way when you'd have said, 'Thank you, Bill,' for a nice bit of fat valley mutton like what this is." He took a big bite off of a sheep's leg that he was toasting and wiped his lip on his sleeve. Yes, I am afraid trolls do behave like that, even the ones with only one head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try a toasted dwarf or even a pony for a change. or else he should have done a good quick bit of burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the troll's pockets, it is nearly always worthwhile, and pinched the very muttons off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their even noticing him. Others more practical, but with less professional pride, would probably have stuck a dagger into each one of them before they observed it. That's a sharp knife. Then the night could have been spent very cheerily. Bilbo knew that. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done before. He was very much alarmed, as well as disgusted. He wished he were 100 miles away. And yet, somehow, he could not go straight back to Thorin and Company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pockets seemed the least difficult. So at last he crept behind a tree, just behind William. Now Bert and Tom, that was the other two trolls, they went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. So then Bilbo plucked up the courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, which we would call a wallet. There was a purse in it as big as a bag to Bilbo. Aha, he thought. This is a beginning. And he carefully started to lift it away. It was a beginning, believe me. Trolls' purses are full of mischief, and this one was no exception. Here, who are you? It squeaked as it left the pocket. And William turned around at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind a tree. Blimey, Bert, look what I've copped. What is it? Said the others. Lummy if I knows. What are you? A Bilbo Baggins, a Hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they cooked him. A Hobbit, they said, startled. Trolls are kind of slow, and they're mighty suspicious about anything new to them. Well, what's a Hobbit got to do with my pocket anyways? Said William. And can you cook 'em? Said Tom. Well, you can try, said Bert when he picked up a skewer. Oh, you wouldn't make above a mouthful, said William, who had already had a fine supper. Not when we had the meat all prepared. Well, perhaps there are more about him, more like him round about here, and we could make a pie, said Bert. Here, you. Are there any more of your sort sneaking around in these here woods? You nasty little rabbit, he said, looking at the Hobbit's furry toes, and he picked him up by the toes and he shook him. Yes, lots, said Bilbo, before he remembered not to tell about his friends. I mean, no, none at all, not one, he said. What do you mean? Said Bert. I mean what I say, said Bilbo. And please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself, and I cook better than I cook, if you know what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast, if only you won't have me for supper. Oh, poor little blighter, said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he had lots of beer. Poor little blighter, just let him go. Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all, said Bert. I don't want to have me throat cut while I'm sleeping. Hold his toes by the fire until he talks. I won't have it, said William. I caught him anyway. You're a fat fool, William, said Bert, as I've said before this evening. And you're a lout. And I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins, says Bert, and he punched William right in the eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. That means a big fight. Bilbo had just enough sense left, when Bert dropped him on the ground, to scramble out of the way of their feet, before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to try to bring them to their senses, and of course that only made them madder than before. Now that would have been the time for Bilbo to leave, But his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round and round, so he just lay there for a while, panting, just outside the circle of firelight. But right in the middle of the fight, up came Balin. The dwarves had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep toward the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave out an awful howl. Ah! Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves, at least uncooked ones. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and, "A sack, Tom! Quick, get a sack!" they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. They popped the sack right over his head, and he was down. "There's more to come yet," says Tom, "or I'm mighty mistook. Lots and none at all it is," says he. "No burra hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves, that's about the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert, "and we best get out of the light." And so they did. With sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other things, they waited in the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and the chewed mutton, in surprise, pop over his head went a nasty, smelly, filthy sack, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Feely and Keely together, and Dory, Nori, and Ori all in a heap, and Owen and Glowin and Biffer and Boffer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach 'em," said Tom, for Biffer and Boffer had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarves will when they're cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and he didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not going well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off, and he said, "What's all this trouble? Who's been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They'd forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with a sack for you." "Oh, they are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could jump on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire on one end, and he poked that right in Bert's eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the fight for a while. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick as a tree trunk. When Tom kicked the sparks in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that and lost one of his front teeth. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind and popped the sack right over Thorin's head and all the way down to his toes. And so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now. That means a bunch of trouble. All neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry trolls and 2 with burns to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them fine, or boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo up in a bush, with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument, they all agreed to it. "No good of roasting them now, it'd take all night," said a voice. Well, Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's a-arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William, and so the argument began all over again. In the end, they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a great big black pot, and they took out their knives. "No good boiling 'em. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom's. "Shut up," they said, "or we'll never have done, and you can go fetch your water yourself if you say any more." "Shut up yourself," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know?" "You're a booby," said William. "And you're a booby yourself," said Tom. And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them and boil them next time. "Which one shall we sit on first?" said the voice. "Better sit on that last fellow first," said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorin, and he thought Tom was talking. "Don't talk to yourself," said Tom. "But if you wants to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which one is he?" "The one with the yellow stockings," said Bert. "Nonsense, the one with the gray stockings," said a voice like William's. "I made sure it was yellow," said Bert. "Yellow it was," said William. "Well, then what did you say it was gray for?" said Bert. "I never did. Tom said it." "That I never did," said Tom. "It was you." 2-1, so shut your mouth," said Bert. "Who are you talking to?" said William. "Now stop it," said Tom and Bert together. "The night's getting on, and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it." "Dawn take you all and be stoned to you," said a voice that sounded like William's. But it wasn't, for just at that moment the light of the sun came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke again, for he stood turned to stone as he stooped over. And Bert and Tom were struck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds perch on them. For trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains that they are made of, which is rocks, and they never move again. That is exactly what happened to Bert and Tom and William. "Excellent," said Gandalf as he stepped from behind a tree, and he helped Bilbo to climb down out of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood it was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling until the light came and made an end of them. And that is the end of episode number 3. We will continue before too long. You guys have a good night. Remember, Grandpa loves you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.